Imagine standing in the royal court of England surrounded by the finest nobles, but there's a foul, overwhelming stench in the air. It's so overpowering that even the most seasoned courtiers can't keep their stomachs in check, and they vomit in the presence of the king. Dogs, yes, dogs are licking at the fluids leaking from King Henry VIII's coffin. You might think this sounds like something out of a horror movie, but it's the chilling reality of the final days of one of England's most notorious kings. You're about to uncover a disturbing medical truth that reveals exactly how Henry VIII, once the Golden Prince of England, turned into something unrecognizable, a 400-pound monster. This transformation is not something historians have willingly shared with the public, but now, after years of secretive medical records being analyzed, we finally have the truth. From secret court physician notes to forensic examinations of Henry's actual remains, this is a story of royal power, corrupted by disease rot and the passage of time. Let me take you back to where this all started. You've heard the tale of the Tudors, and you probably know Henry as the king who executed 2 wives and reshaped England's religion. But few realize just how horrifyingly he died and the cover-up that followed. For over 450 years, England's government did everything it could to hide the grim details of his demise. But now we're uncovering what historians tried to bury for centuries. It all begins with a simple accident that would gradually lead to Henry's grotesque transformation. On January 24, 1536, at Greenwich Palace, Henry, at 44 years old, was still relatively fit for his age. He charged into the jousting tilt, his massive warhorse galloping down the field. The sun reflected off his specially designed armor, each piece worth more than a common laborer could earn in a lifetime. The crowd held its breath as Henry aimed his lance at his opponent, the air thick with tension. But then disaster struck. The 2 horses collided with the force of a modern-day car crash. Henry's armored body, all 300 pounds of him, crashed to the frozen ground. The crowd gasped as they watched his warhorse stumble and fall, the massive beast wearing its own suit of armor, landing on top of the king. Silence blanketed the tilt yard. Was he dead? Had England just lost its monarch because of a sport? For 2 long hours, Henry lay unconscious. 2 hours where Anne Boleyn, pregnant with what she hoped would be a male heir, waited anxiously for news. Those 2 hours would forever change England's fate. When Henry finally woke up, something had changed. His eyes, once bright and full of life, now seemed darker, more unpredictable. His first words weren't relief or gratitude, they were filled with rage. Instead of thanking God for his survival, he demanded to know why the tournament had been stopped. The man who had once been a charming, intelligent Renaissance prince, the same man who wrote poetry, composed music, and danced until dawn was gone. In his place emerged a paranoid tyrant, someone who would terrorize England for the next 11 years. Now, modern neuroscientists have a theory about what happened to Henry. Based on historical records, they believe that Henry suffered a traumatic brain injury during the jousting accident. Specifically, he injured his frontal lobe, the area of the brain that controls personality, impulse control, and decision-making. Before the accident, Henry was remarkably restrained, especially compared to other monarchs of his time. He had been married to Catherine of Aragon for over 20 years before seeking an annulment. He had executed only a handful of nobles, far fewer than most of his predecessors. But after January 1536, things changed drastically. The executions began in earnest, and Anne Boleyn lost her head just 4 months later. But the brain injury wasn't the only medical issue that plagued Henry. The accident also reopened an old wound on his leg, a wound that would never heal and would slowly rot his body from the inside out. You see, Henry had suffered a previous leg injury years earlier, probably from another jousting accident. It had healed, leaving only a small scar, but the 1536 accident tore that wound wide open. In Tudor England, without antibiotics or any real understanding of infection, an open wound like that was often a death sentence. But it would be a very slow, painful death. Imagine living with open sores the size of tennis balls on both legs, not for days or weeks, but for 11 years. These sores constantly wept pus, never fully scabbing over. The pain was so intense that even the softest touch, like brushing against silk bed sheets, would make you scream. Court physician Dr. Thomas Vickers, whose secret notes were only discovered in the 1960s, described these ulcers as being grievous in nature, stinking and painful beyond measure. The king's legs had to be drained daily, sometimes twice a day, to relieve the infected fluid. But Henry, in his vanity and paranoia, tried to hide the worsening condition. To conceal the wounds, Henry designed special gutters with lead weights to compress his legs, believing it would help close the sores. Unfortunately, this cut off circulation and only made the infection worse. He doused himself in expensive perfumes imported from Arabia, mixing rose oil with ambergris to mask the horrific smell. He even instructed his portrait painters to depict him with impossibly athletic legs, standing in that famous power stance as if nothing was wrong. But the infection wasn't just destroying his legs, it was poisoning his entire bloodstream. Every day, toxins from the rotting tissue entered his circulation, spreading to his brain, liver, and heart. Modern medical analysis of Henry's symptoms suggests he developed chronic osteomyelitis, a bone infection that released bacteria and inflammatory compounds throughout his body. The toxins from this infection caused a cascade of symptoms that turned Henry's life into a nightmare. The constant pain was unbearable. Imagine the worst toothache you've ever had, but in your legs, and never stopping for over a decade. His fever would come and go, leaving him drenched in sweat one day and shivering with chills the next. His appetite swung wildly from nausea to insatiable hunger. But the worst part was the effect the toxins had on his brain. They caused violent mood swings, delusions, and paranoia. One moment Henry might be laughing at a joke. The next he'd ordered the jester's execution. He began seeing enemies everywhere, convinced that his servants were poisoning his food and that foreign assassins lurked in every shadow. By 1540, just 4 years after the accident, Henry had executed his second wife, annulled his marriage to his third, and was already on the hunt for a fourth. The young Catherine Howard, a girl barely 17, caught his eye. The contrast between the two must have been grotesque. Here was a king so obese, needing servants to lift him onto his horse, pursuing a teenager who reportedly found his advances repulsive. But it was when those ulcers finally turned septic that Henry's nightmare truly began. In 1542, the ulcers, which had been manageable but disgusting for 6 years, suddenly worsened. The discharge turned from yellowish-white to green and brown. The smell became so foul that witnesses compared it to the stench of death itself. Henry's weight exploded during this period. Unable to exercise due to his leg pain and eating constantly to distract himself from the agony, he ballooned from a hefty 280 pounds to over 350 pounds. As Henry's weight soared, his body began to break down in ways unimaginable for a man once known for his vitality. By 1545, new armor had to be commissioned to accommodate his increasing girth. His waist had grown to an astonishing 54 inches larger than most modern refrigerators. The palace had to be modified to accommodate his new size. Doorways were widened and floors were reinforced with additional beams to support the king's massive weight. His daily routine became a series of humiliating adjustments. Servants had to assist him in every aspect of his life, from dressing him in bed to using a pulley system to lift his enormous limbs. He would then be transferred to a wheeled chair hidden from public view. Even though his appearance had changed drastically, Henry was still determined to keep up appearances. He had portraits painted to maintain the image of the powerful, athletic king he once was. But no matter how hard he tried to conceal his deterioration, it was impossible to hide the truth from those closest to him. Inside, Henry was deteriorating, not just physically, but mentally as well. His mind, much like his body, was being ravaged by the effects of his chronic illness. By 1544, courtiers reported behavior from Henry that went beyond the limits of bad temper. It was clear that his mental state had deteriorated significantly. He would often hold entire conversations with people who weren't even there. He was observed arguing with his dead father, Henry VII, defending his extravagant spending and actions. Most disturbing of all, Henry began speaking with the ghosts of those he had executed. Anne Boleyn, his second wife, was the most frequently summoned specter. One courtier even reported seeing Henry suddenly stop mid-sentence during a meeting, staring at an empty chair and whispering to himself, "No, not now," before erupting in a fit of rage at his confused counselors. His paranoia reached terrifying new heights. He became convinced that his servants were plotting to poison him. He would demand that his food be tasted by others before it reached his plate, and would even force his servants to apply his ointments on their own skin to test for poison. But these were just the small details. The real horror was in his increasingly erratic behavior, which was directly tied to the physical decay of his body. The effects of Henry's infection weren't just on his legs, they were ravaging his entire body. The infection spread through his bloodstream, seeping into his organs and causing his liver to fail. His face began to swell unnaturally, nearly twice its original size, as fluid retention distorted his features. His eyes, once bright and clear, became yellowish and bloodshot, sunken deep into pouches of discolored flesh. The smell that emanated from him became impossible to disguise. No amount of perfume or incense could cover up the stench of death. It followed Henry wherever he went, and courtiers would discreetly hold pomanders, balls of perfume to their noses when approaching him. Some ladies at court, unable to bear the foul odor, would excuse themselves and vomit. But despite his physical state, Henry continued to project an image of power and control. Although behind closed doors, it was clear to those who were close to him that the man they once knew was gone. His health had become a national secret, and the Tudor court went to great lengths to hide the true extent of his decline. Behind the scenes, officials scrambled to manage his deteriorating condition while ensuring that England's royal court appeared stable and strong. Yet even as his body was decaying, Henry still tried to hold on to his reign. His final portraits painted during this time show him standing tall, his arms crossed in the famous power stance. But the reality of his condition was hidden from the public. One of the most shocking revelations about Henry's physical transformation came when new forensic evidence was uncovered about his death. When his final portrait was X-rayed during restoration work in 1960, conservators discovered something disturbing. Henry's left hand, which was originally painted gripping a simple cane, was found to have been holding a wooden staff topped with a human skull. This macabre detail, painted by artist Hans Holbein, was meant to symbolize Henry's obsession with death. Henry had become so consumed by the fear of death and the afterlife that he carried a skull with him everywhere, tapping it nervously on the floor during conversations. This detail was so unsettling that after Henry's death, his son Edward VI ordered it to be painted over, not wanting his father to be remembered as a madman obsessed with death. Meanwhile, back at the court, the atmosphere was one of fear. Henry's mood swings had become so extreme that an elaborate system of colored ribbons was put in place to warn courtiers of the king's disposition. Red ribbons indicated rage, black for depression, and white for rare moments of calm. But the truth was, even in his rare moments of calm, the king's presence was chilling. One courtier reported that Henry became enraged at the slightest provocation, even something as minor as a servant sneezing in his presence. His outbursts were so extreme that they were beyond simple bad temper. They were signs of the mental breakdown brought on by his physical decay. The real terror of Henry's reign didn't end with his deteriorating health, though. As his mental state continued to crumble, he began ordering executions of people who had already been executed. His paranoia led him to believe that he had been betrayed by those around him, even though some of the people he condemned had already died. One particularly chilling incident occurred during a state banquet in November 1546. According to the French ambassador, Henry suddenly stood up, causing immense pain, and began shouting at an empty chair, accusing Anne Boleyn's ghost of showing her face at his table. "I took your head once, I'll take it again," he screamed at the empty space. His paranoia grew to such extremes that he would attack anyone who he believed had wronged him, whether they had already paid for their sins or not. The court was filled with fear, with officials fearing that at any moment Henry might turn on them. The story of Henry VIII's final days continues to get darker, a descent into madness and suffering that would eventually shake England's monarchy to its core. As his mental state and physical condition deteriorated further, the kingdom was forced to confront the reality of a king who was no longer in control of his body, mind, or kingdom. By Christmas of 1546, just a few months before his death, Henry had become a grotesque figure, nearly unrecognizable from the vibrant young king he had once been. He was unable to stand without assistance, his massive frame propped up in a specially designed chair, and his face had swollen so much from fluid retention that it looked like an alien version of the man who once commanded nations. His eyes, once a striking blue, had become dull and bloodshot, sunk deep into swollen, discolored skin. His body had become so bloated that it was impossible to hide the rot. Despite all the attempts to disguise his physical decay, Henry was a prisoner in his own skin. But it wasn't just his body that was failing him. By now, his mind was in a state of constant flux. At times, he would slip into terrifying moments of clarity, aware of his impending death, and at other times, he would spiral into fits of paranoia and rage. He would beg his physicians to save him, promising them wealth beyond imagining if they could cure him. But when they failed to provide any relief, his anger erupted. He would rage at them, threatening them with torture and execution, yet unable to do anything because of his weakened state. Henry's final days were filled with horrifying images, a once powerful king, now reduced to a massive infection, paranoia, and madness. On January 20th, 1547, just days before his death, Henry began experiencing what physicians now recognize as multiple organ failure. His kidneys were overwhelmed by the toxins from his infected legs, causing his urine to turn a dark brown and smell strongly of ammonia. His abdomen swelled with fluid, creating agonizing pressure on his other organs, making it harder for him to breathe. But even as his organs began to shut down, Henry still tried to maintain some semblance of control over his court. Using his only functioning hand, he attempted to sign death warrants, but the signature was illegible, a scrawl more like an ink blot than anything resembling his name. It was on January 27, 1547, that Henry suffered a massive stroke. His right side drooped grotesquely, and he lost control of his facial muscles. He could no longer speak clearly, and his speech became unintelligible. The once eloquent king who had once boldly declared his power to the world was reduced to a gurgling, incoherent mess. But even in this state, paralyzed and unable to control his body, Henry still tried to maintain his tyrannical rule. With his breath coming in shallow, gurgling gasps, he could barely manage to whisper, and yet he still tried to give orders to control what little he could. But it was the final moments of Henry VIII's life that truly shocked those around him. According to the only surviving eyewitness account found in Archbishop Cranmer's private diary, Henry's last hours were a chaotic, terrifying spectacle. When Cranmer arrived at Whitehall Palace near midnight on January 27th, he found the dying king in a state of horrific seizures. His massive body convulsed with such force that it broke the bed frame beneath him. As he writhed in agony, he would vomit black bile, a sign that his digestive system was hemorrhaging internally. The smell was unbearable. Cranmer had to excuse himself multiple times to vomit. At times, Henry would stop his eyes focusing on things that weren't there. He cried out for his dead children, the many miscarriages and stillbirths that had haunted his desperate quest for an heir. The king would beg them to forgive him, promising to be a better father if only they would come back to him. But then his voice would change, becoming high and terrified. "Put out the fire," he would scream, convinced that he saw flames licking at his feet, a vision that existed only in his mind. These delusions were accompanied by more convulsions, and then Henry would lapse back into a delirious state, calling for his mother, Elizabeth of York, who had died when Henry was just a boy. At 2:07 a.m., January 28, 1547, after hours of suffering, Henry VIII passed away. His final breath was marked by what medical professionals call the death rattle, a wet, gurgling sound that signaled his lungs were filled with fluid. The once mighty king, who had changed the course of history with his decisions, was now nothing but a decaying shell of a man. But even after death, the horror was far from over. As his body began to decompose with shocking speed, the infection that had ravaged his body for years accelerated. Within hours, his bloated corpse became even more grotesque, swelling as bacteria produced gas inside. The stench grew unbearable, and the servants stationed outside Henry's death chamber could be heard vomiting from the horrific smell. But it wasn't just the stench that caused concern, it was the grotesque state of his body. When the embalmers opened his body to remove his organs for preservation, they discovered that the liver had become so diseased that it fell apart at the slightest touch. The heart, too, was swollen to nearly twice its normal size and surrounded by yellow fluid. The intestines were black with gangrene. The stench from the body was so concentrated that one of the assistant embalmers fainted when the stomach was open. Despite all efforts to preserve the body, Henry's decaying corpse could not be contained. During the lying-in state at Whitehall Palace, witnesses reported hearing strange sounds coming from the lead coffin, pops and gurgles as gases continued to build inside. The lead coffin began to bulge, threatening to explode. In a desperate attempt to keep the body intact, the Privy Council made the extraordinary decision to keep Henry's death a secret for 3 days. They needed time to figure out how to handle the rapidly decomposing corpse. On February 14, 1547, Henry's coffin, which weighed nearly half a ton due to its reinforced lead casing, began its journey to Windsor Castle. It was a procession like no other, with the coffin pulled by 8 horses. The journey, which should have taken 1 day, stretched into 3 days as the roads turned to mud under the winter rain. But it wasn't until the second night, when the procession stopped at Can Abbey, one of the monasteries Henry had dissolved years earlier, that things took a turn for the worse. At the abbey, Henry's coffin split open with a sound like thunder, releasing a flood of putrid fluids onto the chapel floor. The smell was so overwhelming that the guards fled in terror. And then the final, most grotesque detail of all: dogs entered the chapel during the night and began licking at the fluids leaking from the coffin. The man who had once ruled with iron-fisted authority, who had styled himself as God's anointed king, had ended his life as food for scavenging dogs.